Oh man, despite StreamYard's problems, I still continue to love it. Anyways, we're here with uh uh we're here with labor union representative George Meany. Is there a labor crisis in America? So that was a Simpsons bit from classic Krusty. Apparently George Meany was a real guy, and he actually was integral to pushing during the civil rights movement the destruction of free association in America in terms of the labor force. But anyways, there's a great article on it. But I'm here with my good friend Zoomer Schopenhauer. It's been a while, and you've made a turn recently in your philosophic endeavors towards, I guess, what people would call nowadays 2017 pine tree coal, but I think it's more meaningful than that. In your Substack, which I know you've periodically deleted a lot of stuff over the years, but you've written quite a very interesting and illuminating article on different theories as it relates to ecology, carrying capacity. What's that particular theory that you were illuminating that was made in the 80s? Slingshot, overshoot.
Yeah,
theory.
overshoot.
Yeah. And you've made sort of an ecological turn in your thinking, and yes. I think that I mean, for the sake of sort of going against the grain, and people have accused me over the years of sort of swimming along with the currents. I think that this type of work is of course needed, because what's the point of online alternative writing or alternative forms of knowledge creation, but to swim against the grain? And I think that's a good question to start off with, besides how have you been and all that stuff, and what really provoked this sort of ecological turn in your own research and thought, and also why is it that nowadays, by which I mean the 2020s, there has been, I would say, a very hair-raising and kind of like, I wouldn't say, well, violence a loaded word, but there's been sort of like a very stark reaction against these ideas that you would find in a lot of online spaces, not just in the online right, but also like in certain elements of the left. Why is it that ecological thinking or deep ecology or environmental studies has been so thoroughly rejected by the luminaries and thought leaders of online discourse?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of reasons. I mean, I think one of them is that taking a position that there is going to be some sort of collapse, and I mean, I think that there is going to be some sort of collapse. I mean, I tend to sort of follow along with John Michael Greer.
Catabolic collapse. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But what he really says is that, like, there isn't going to be like some singular event. Like, there's going to be a series of bottlenecks, and within those bottlenecks, there's probably going to be a series of routes and rallies. But by the end of it, you have come out with a much simpler and less prosperous global system than when you started out going through these bottlenecks. And by the end of it, it looks like you've gone through a collapse. And there could be shock events. There could be certain things which really accelerate things. But there isn't going to be some single thing. There's things that we're already going through, but these are slow processes, many of which have tipping points, but which they take time. And there's a burnout with this, because like if you think that something is going to happen, and then they just burned out and they end up saying, well, nothing ever happens, like, I think that some of this is the result of people on the ecological side, like back in like the late 2000s. Peak oil became a huge part of discourse, and then it completely disappeared because of the shale revolution in America.
Yeah.
And so it seemed to just like go out of the cycle, and people say, "Oh, nothing happened." And part of this was the fault of the peak oilers, who, in a sense, they're like, "It's going to be this date. No, it's going to be that date. It's going to be this date. No, it's going to be that." And then, of course,
really Mayan calendar-like in a way.
yeah, and the point was that that's really not what was significant. And also, peak oil did not go away just because of the shale revolution in America. I mean, in America, the current schedule for peak oil is now 2027. According to the Energy Information Agency. I see no reason as to why that's wrong, but this time it's going to be much more difficult for there to be some kind of off-ramp, because the shale oil is essentially oil which is trapped inside shale rocks. Those are the source rocks. That is actually where the rest of the American oil came from. And there is no obvious way to get that production back up. And mind you, 70% of all of American oil is now shale oil, and all except for the Permian Basin of these shale plays have peaked, because it actually depletes much faster than the older conventional plays. And so, yeah, I mean, this issue did not go away, but again, it's just that people in the late 2000s were overly confident that these unconventional oil supplies would not come online. It's too expensive. It's too difficult. It's not going to. Well, it did happen, and so they got that wrong. But but then this kind of reductionist thinking then took this countervailing tendency, where the technophile optimists just say, it didn't end up being anything, and that just took over. The other so I think that there is this inherent burnout that people have with positions of forecasting any kind of pessimistic outcome, and people do get locked into the present. They really do get locked into the present, and they end up not really looking at very reliable long-term trends, which are if you follow them, then you can read implications into this. But I think you have to have a certain amount of honesty about what you do know and what you don't know about the future, the way things could play out, looking at various different scenarios. But there are some things which I think you can say for are a certainty. But I think that huge ecology, it's just a slowly ongoing process. It's a slowly ongoing process, about 1.5% decline every year in insect biomass. Like that's a huge percentage, but it is a slow process, which, and eventually that will cause very, very, very serious problems for the global economic system.
Like you were saying in your article, you had a bunch of tiers about the different 9 levels of things that were required for advanced civilization. And there's a bunch of, you highlighted a bunch of breaches to those carrying capacities and structures. If you could maybe explain, sorry I cut you off, but
okay. Well, I would say that the turn towards ecological thinking came from the insight from Steve Keen initially, which was that he has this phrase called capital without energy is a sculpture, labor without energy is a corpse. Which is that in the traditional neoclassical economics, labor and capital are the source of wealth.
Right.
And the thing is that, however, is that energy is a fundamental input to both. A human being without food is dead, and capital without a constant energy input of some kind or another is just a hunk of junk. A city is a museum without a constant throughput of energy and material. And so in a sense, the economy is not just a medium of exchange, it's also an energy dissipating superorganism, which takes in inputs and outputs it as high entropy waste.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem of modernity is that we have exponentially been growing by taking in vast amounts of fossil carbon, in particular, which is this extremely energy dense. So energy density that's the amount of energy per unit volume. And so the point is that coal, oil, gas, they have a huge amount of energy for the amount of volume that they have. They're easily transportable, and they can instantly be transferred from heat energy into mechanical energy, electrical energy, all sorts of things.
Right.
And what we were able to do with the invention of the heat engine, in particular, starting with the steam engine and then the internal combustion engine and so forth, is we were able to harness this, and this was the engine of growth. Growth is tied to energy at almost 100%. It's also tied to materials at almost 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And what this means is that, however, the kick is that the machine grows at an exponential pace. So what happened in modernity is that Malthus looks like he was wrong, in the sense that Malthus thought that population growth tends to follow the exponential curve. You tend to have an exponential growth in the number of people, generation to generation. That could be reversing soon, but not yet in a lot of places. But in any case, the general rule is that it's an exponential curve. And he said, well, it doesn't seem like carrying capacity, it doesn't seem like the land is going to follow this rule, that is going to also grow exponentially. And so what he said is that this eventually leads to the four horsemen of like starvation, famine, disease,
war as well.
War
over resources.
And the thing is that you look backwards from 1798, when his essay was first written, and the model actually looks extremely good. You have these cyclical patterns of inflation, pauperism, elite overproduction, civil war, and famine, and and disease. They tend to actually follow cyclical patterns,
right,
which tend to follow population pressure.
Well, also like rent-seeking managerialism would be another indicator of a higher, well, people would think like would be a higher rung in civilization, but ultimately require even more vast expenditure of resources.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the point is that looking backwards, humanity in its agrarian phase, which goes back to the Holocene, 12,000 years ago, we invent agriculture, but we don't escape the carrying capacity rules, really.
Right.
I mean, we do to a small extent, but we keep following these negative feedback loops. So you have the mid-17th century crisis, you have the Black Death, you have these kind of cyclical patterns of imperial rise and decline. You have all sorts of things like this where we don't really escape these patterns. Whereas in modernity, we seem to abolish all limits.
Right, exactly.
Abolish all limits. And what the thing about modernity is, I think that in some sense, the progressive actually underestimates modernity. The progressive doesn't really understand what has given them this, the basis of this immense progress and this immense comfort. And the thing which has led to that is fundamentally the availability and mass exploitation of cheap energy. Complexity and growth are only possible with very high energy return on investment, easily available material. That's the only model that we've ever had for this kind of exponential growth over the modern period. And the point being that this exists in what William Catton, who wrote the book Overshoot, calls a system of drawdown. And so if you look at agriculture is less efficient than it was prior to modernity. And this seems like it doesn't make any sense, but it actually does. There has been a decline in ROI of agriculture to the point where it's practically negative, because we actually expend more energy in agriculture than we get out in calories.
In terms of expending like the resource of a human body, that they can get the subsistence farming as opposed to.
You have to do phosphorus mining. You have to use high heat and industry to make the natural gas to create the fertilizer. You need the agrochemical business. You need the oil, which makes the combine harvesters and the combine harvesters and the tractors and the trucks and the ships and the aviation, which does the supply. You need the electricity for greenhouses. You need a vast expense of energy in order to actually get people these calories. And so what has happened is that the backbreaking labor has gone away and the whole system has become much more cost efficient. It's much more cost efficient, but it's actually much less energy efficient because it's this huge sink of energy. And the mistake that we make is we treat as interest, we treat as this subsidy of cheap energy which we get as though it were the interest, the surplus generated by the earth. But in fact, we're eating into the capital. That's the overshoot. We're drawing down 10 million times as fast this material. And this material, fossil carbon, we have no replacement for it on the horizon. It's not just that there's stuff in the works and we're making progress. No, there's nothing on the horizon that is viable to replace it.
Well, you mentioned this phrase. Yeah, you mentioned this phrase about sort of taking the investments or robbing the future of investment of energy and resources for the present. But then I wanted to go back a little bit to the oil because there's a million directions that we could go in here. It's a very fascinating discussion. I've been researching into environmental thoughts, since like 2014 even, you know. But when I stopped being like a contard conservative, you know, reading the National Post and listening to people like Ezra Levant when I was a teenager, that has that book about ethical oil or whatever.
Yeah.
Two things. One, do you believe in the sort of they claim that there's, for example, Russian geologists that are just geolocked because they're all writing in Russian. Do you believe in any validity to abiotic oil at all?
Absolutely not. No.
Okay, there you go. Yeah.
Human beings, we follow something according to the systems ecologist, Harry Odom, called the maximum power principle, which is that we seek an energy gradient. We seek to maximize the amount of energy we can get over the minimum amount of time. And we seek to reach and grow towards our carrying capacity as a K-selected species. And so I do not believe that there is any government in the world which, if it had access to cheap, easily available material that it could easily use to power its economy, drive its growth, beat its international competition, that it's going to hide the fact that this is a very rapidly replenishing resource. It's not true. It just doesn't make any sense. And so no, oil, it comes from ancient oceans, which it's from algae. And to a minority of it is plankton, and that's the story of oil, basically, full stop. You know, coal comes from ancient trees, but it's all ancient stored photosynthesis.
There's some people that have come out with some research against that, and they say, but I think like the point being is that even if there were, say if the Earth had the capacity to have some kind of what's the right word? Some kind of natural process or phytoplankton or whatever that could regenerate oil. Your point would be that it's sort of a moot point because we would just use it up all. We would use it all up anyways, and it wouldn't really matter.
We have half-baked oil. We have half-baked oil. It's called oil shale. Confusingly, because shale oil is the stuff underground. It's in rocks, but we have oil shale, and basically, it's this material called kerogen, which you can find, for example, in Colorado, just out in the mountains. And the point is that it's useless because you need to heat it up to like 300 degrees, and then it turns into crude oil. But
Mhm.
obviously, if you have to use all that energy to heat it up, then it's basically useless. It has an ROI that's lower than wheat. So it's not useful for the global economic system. So yeah, we do have half-baked oil. It's called oil shale, and it's useless. We have half-baked coal. It's called peat, and I mean the Irish use it, but they're not a model to follow. So
Well,
yeah.
yeah. But another thing about oil, because there's a lot of things to discuss about like the
Mhm.
YIMBY thing and this abundance theory
Yes.
in vogue idea that, anyways, we'll get to it. But about oil, I think, if you follow the work of, for example, Chad Haig, brilliant, one of the most brilliant philosophers of our day.
Yeah.
He talks about how the theory that people, or rather the approach people have when it comes to oil, specifically when it comes to plastics, plasticizers, and plastic products,
Yeah.
is that because we visually see it as inert, we tend to believe that it is inert. When in reality, we know that because of microplastics and because of the inherent, property of oil, we know that it's not inert, and that actually, there's some people that believe that there will come an age where there will be alternative materials, especially in regards to food storage and food production, and that they've been developing these materials since the 80s. Bacteria that can eat plastic and turn it back into oil. But then, what if it goes throughout the world and does this, and would it affect critical infrastructure? But seeing that reality, what have you observed in terms of oil as really, you could say, the way that Chad Haig approaches it as a sort of question of being, fundamentally, because oil is so important to daily life. Like you were mentioning the car engine.
Yeah.
The engine really accelerates modernity in the sense that it travails temporality and spatiality, and it brings the world together, or it rather closes in the gaps of vast distances to such a degree that these things that modern, what I like to call transnational progressivism, globalization, multiculturalism, diffusion of knowledge, the computer, all of these things are essentially on the backbone of an accelerant to the res extensia of human ability that comes from the engine, and comes from oil in particular.
Yeah.
And plastics are even further, because now you have prolonged food storage, you have very cheap and easy means of creating things, engineering things, even painting. I mean, the paint I use, acrylic, is essentially plastic.
Yeah.
But then these substances are not really this inert thing, this like putty that you can transform into anything based off of your imagination, based off of economic demand or human demand, but rather it's something that's actually doing something at a very microscopic level. So what is your approach to the greater question of oil, modernity, plastic, and what is really to be done if these things that have given us these so-called great feats and humanly investments of modernity are really turning against us in such a fundamental level? Like, what is your thoughts on all of this? Yeah.
Well, in a sense, there are two aspects of the problem of overshoot. Overshoot is about dumping waste, the high entropy waste that we generate as a superorganism. We dump that waste back into nature, and it infects us. I mean, we're taking synthetic material and chemicals which were not naturally generated, which of course in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but many of them are actually poisoning us. I mean, you have endocrine disruptors from plastic, and yet we can't get rid of this material because it's so useful for piping, for storage, for medical institutions, for packaging. I mean, plastic does such a myriad of functions because it's so easy to mass produce. Of course, it's basically a petrochemical. It's from that industry, and it does poison us. Endocrine disruptors do alter our chemicals. They have actually lowered sperm count. They have lowered testosterone, not only in human but other mammals. And it actually is a serious problem. We don't know what the effects of microplastics finding their way in our brains are. But in a sense, this aspect of Overshoot is, in a sense, a crisis of abundance.
Mm-hmm.
It is a function of just the sheer quantity of modernity, of produce, and the sheer production of such vast amounts of material beyond which nature or ourselves can assimilate. So we're going above the assimilative capacity. That's true also for example, the phosphorus and nitrogen, which we use as fertilizers. They go into the ecosystem, and they cause eutrophication. They create great dead zones, and they destroy lakes and so forth. I mean, the biggest lake in the whole of Ireland has basically been destroyed by this. Huge ways of Mexican coastal areas as well. And of course, global heating is also a function of this. I mean, carbon is just our greatest waste product. And it does have these serious effects, and also ocean acidification. And of course, the plastic and chemical pollution. And basically, that's one side of it. The other is basically the withdrawing beyond the regenerative capacity. And so green water supply, that's another one of the 9 planetary. So green water is the natural occurring water in soil, and blue water is the rivers and aquifers and lakes and so forth. They're all being drawn beyond what is safe. The destruction of land and natural ecosystems at the altar of growth, that's also beyond what is a safe boundary. Like it's a very multifaceted crisis, and of course the disappearance of nature. I mean, an 83% reduction since 1960 of the populations of all wild animals.
Yes.
A 50% reduction of all wild plants. A hugely larger than normal extinction rate. I mean, 96% of all biomass of mammals is humans and their livestock.
This is, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
But essentially, we are, the human enterprise is just so vast. I mean, the growther has this classic, the Yimbys, they all have this classic tweet, which they all post, where they look outside a plane. And they look and they say, look, it's why are there not all these housing developments for immigrants being built here? And essentially you're like, well, look, this is farmland. This is farmland. This is literally there's crops being rotated here. There is food being grown. I
don't think Noah Smith has ever seen a farmland and has ever been on a farm in his life. So it's, the classic John Winthrop tweet, America's actually not full. We could just compress billions of people into tiny sugar cubes.
Well, you see, the thing is about...
put them in silos.
Well, one of the points that Yimbys make is that America has an absolutely bizarre urban planning situation where... like people, they only allow you to build like single family houses, and there's like no lemonade stands or shops or anything allowed, and people have to make these great drives into the city, which take hours and just fill.
Well, that is a good point. I got to admit.
I get it. Like American cities are far bigger than they need to be.
Right.
Like European cities do not look like this, and they function a lot better, and people are less miserable. And so actually, a lot of American cities could be, in a sense, densified, and it would be more productive. You would need to destroy less land in order to do it. But the point is that overall, the amount of weight of products and that are shifted by the human enterprise is 24 times the amount that is moved by geological processes now, and the amount of weight of all human-made structures weighs more than all of life combined on this planet. It's over 1 trillion tons. And the point is that the city is not this self-contained unit. It is a massive energy and material and logistical node, which is constantly requiring mass inputs to be constantly moved into it. But the urbanite isn't really psychologically conscious of this because they work in a service job and they don't really have experience with the world of production and the world of agriculture. I mean, and so
well, they don't
think
even
about
the back alleys in which product is shipped into the buildings in the shops. Yeah,
Yeah.
they don't even venture there. So,
yeah, and but no, I mean, like, you know, so the question is, like, do you really want to like destroy the rest of naturally occurring ecosystems, or do you want to destroy your own farms so that you're then having to import materials from other farms and also support like diesel gushing tankers and ships?
yeah.
I mean, you know, it doesn't really make sense.
Maybe we could do the Peter Thiel seasteading thing. Would that be that'd be even worse. That'd be Waterworld in no time.
Yeah.
You know, but yeah, go ahead.
No, but essentially the human enterprise, what Malthus got wrong is that when you go forward from Malthus, we seem to abolish all limits, but what we're actually doing is we're stealing from the future. In the sense that we go above our carrying capacity, in the sense that we go above what you could indefinitely live by in a certain area. You could indefinitely live at that standard of life in this patch of land with this number of people at this consumptive habit. We go way above that by drawing down resources that future generations would have been able to consume. And so what we do is we steal the future in order to make the present more prosperous. It's a completely absurd game. I mean, at the beginning of Overshoot, William Catton, he recounts this story, and essentially this, it's during the Russian Civil War, and this whole village has been shifted due to the fighting, and this kind of refugee community in the steppe are basically starving to death, and there is just a lone soldier who is guarding this big grain depot, and the American aid journalist comes in and he asks the villagers, why have you not overwhelmed that soldier and taken that grain? And the village elder said, well, that grain is the seeds for the next planting season. You know, you can't steal from the future. But that's the mentality which we have, is that there will always be some kind of technological fix to any resource or problem that we could have. And it's not actually a viable solution in any way, because efficiency has never resulted in human beings acting more frugally. It's always been used as a catalyst to enable more consumption and just feed the economic system.
Well, that reminds me of Bataille's Accursed Share, which I wanted to talk about a little later. But I wanted to go back a little bit to what you said about I was going to say the word. Planetary biodiversity. And this is something that Derek Jensen quite poetically talks about in various works, such as A Language Older Than Words, where he relates his own personal experiences of childhood trauma with his father, and to the greater ecology as a whole. But people would say, and I guess the response by people, which it's very funny how a lot of political categories have been shifting, because traditionally you would, in the late 20th century, environmentalism was always coded as something that is left wing, and this sort of like sappy hippie crunchy granola core, don't you care about the biodiversity of the earth, and all these species dying out. But now it seems that, I mean, I shouldn't say that, because there's a huge sort of futuristic Nietzschean vitalist, whatever you want to call it, element of the right that has turned against deep ecology. But there still is, nevertheless, I think, a lot of thought that environmentalism is something that is, I wouldn't say apolitical, but definitely crosses political boundaries. But it's very funny to see people that were sort of crunchy hippie granola left-wingers make the abundance argument, and we will define what this abundance theory craze is, but make the argument that efficiency is a human good. And really it goes down to Heidegger's thesis on inframing, that, okay, so all of these species are disappearing, all of these species of not just animal life, but flora and fauna are being destroyed, and certain species are being cultivated to have maximum yield. Like, for example, even something as mundane as the watermelon species of the earth are totally different, or bananas or apples. But they would say that, well, if we can frame nature to have greater carrying capacity for humans, maybe some animals, use synthetic proteins to make sure that we're not totally obliterating animal life. It's like this weird, like, morality car wash fiat. But how would you defend the view of nature that environmentalists like Derek Jensen defend, that this is a great tragedy on the scale of a truly planetary and even spiritual crisis of the Earth giving up 90% of its species to inframe and to make things standing reserve into such a way that the only species of plant and animal life that matter are ones that are deemed useful? So yeah, go ahead.
In a sense, the great crisis of thought is one of reductionism.
Right.
Because what we do as an economic system is we take out a part of nature and we place a certain economic value on it, and we use it for various purposes.
Right.
But we don't think about the value of the whole of nature. And nature is in a kind of equilibrium. It's not necessarily a wholesome Chungus equilibrium. It involves
of course, it can be very violent and
violence, but it does exist in a kind of equilibrium. And the whole biosphere, the soil, the nutrition of the soil, the air that we breathe, it was all generated by life, and life regulated by other forms of life, which all perform vital functions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the reasons why we don't particularly like insects, despite how important they are, is that they're constantly dealing with excrement. But if they were not decomposing that excrement and recycling those nutrients back around the biosphere, it wouldn't function, and we would be in a disastrous situation. I mean, obviously, in more romantic senses, we require bees and other pollinators. And, you know, there is a complex relationship between ants, plants, predators, and so forth, which generate the green blue earth which we live in. And it exists in a kind of a whole, whereas we don't think like that. We tend to think in reductionist terms, and we think in terms of what we can get out of it.
Yes.
And what we can take and process and use for economic value. I think that there is a value in analyzing these things from a purely materialistic lens, even if it is a holistic one, because I think that people often make the mistake and fall into a kind of ignoramus glut of despair when they, in a sense, feel that there is something wrong, that there is something illusory about modernity, and retreat into a kind of a spiritualist bubble where they try and escape it through poetry or art or religion or something, and disengage with it. But to me, the mistake here is not to be spiritual. The mistake is to find a spiritual diagnosis and then to try and uncover that there must be some kind of material problem and invent a crisis, and to look for any negative trend, and to fall into sort of collapse optimism and cynicism,
Right.
and to just disengage. And we all know people like this. This is exactly how many movements have collapsed into. But I think that what you do is you look at the various multifaceted and interlinked material problems which we have, and you try to, and once you do so, you begin to uncover traces of a deeper spiritual malaise. And that's what I think happens when you look at the various multi-headed demon that is facing us from so many different angles and that are so interlinked. You begin to uncover a deep spiritual malaise, which does go down to this just reductionist, utilitarian thinking about everything around us. And I think that a huge part of this is living in a disciplinary society which shapes people's behavior, not coercively, but simply that people love their families.
Yeah, it's the power to say yes instead of no. Psychopower, as Ben Chauhan talks
people,
about.
They love their families and they care about them. They are capable of being future orientated, and thinking about the future and thinking about what basis are we really and what values are we, according to which are we doing things. But the main hat that they have on, so to speak, is the hat of the next quarterly report and of their mortgage and of all of these things which tie them into this the economic system, which has to keep exponentially growing. But of course, exponential growth is a suicidal and completely destructive goal to orientate a society or a planet towards. Cannot keep going. It is a metabolism. It is a metabolism which burns through and destroys itself precisely because it's exponential. And people do not understand the exponential curve. They are very faulty in their intuitions about it. And so in a sense, that's the real problem. Is I think people are biophilic. People love nature, but they are constantly re-plugged back into the matrix, so to speak, of the growth engine, which is in many senses faltering, which is already producing suboptimal outcomes in some ways. But it's never enough. It's never enough to be knocked over. And people have so much abundant wealth. They can go to a restaurant which is well lit and well heated, buy a pizza, and then come back, watch Netflix. That's not the kind of society which has a revolution.
Exactly.
Barfing as some kind of street activist or a fighter. This kind of apathy is absolutely inevitable, and we are completely locked into clown world until something were to happen which made the situation significantly worse, which will happen. But we're not there yet.
Well, I think I misspoke. I wouldn't peg the sort of I know it's like such a cliche term, the Nietzschean vitalist is this, but there's certainly like a tech right, quote unquote right, like the Theolites, because there's a lot of like even like Nietzschean vitalist people on Twitter that they have a great love and fondness for natural ecology, and they the tweet of like this rare species like the last Tasmanian dog is worth more than 1 billion third worlders. And so, but I do think that there is sort of like from the conservative mainstream. There's apathy towards nature.
The technological lens it's the wrong lens to think. Technology is not the answer. That doesn't even necessarily mean that I think that technology is the problem. I actually kind of follow Heidegger when he said that we have to have a free relationship towards technology.
Right.
And in a sense, to me, to look at a particular technology and say that it is, quote unquote, the problem is a form of reductionist thinking. The question is, what is the systematic context in which this technology is used?
Or how it arose and how it's being used and why it's being used
exactly.
in terms of why do people use the internet not for the betterment of their own souls, for information and for self-expression and art and knowledge creation? Why do they use it for prawn or drama streamers? Yeah. Why do they use it for nonsense? It's not the inherent property of the technology, because these technologies have obviously borne fruit. I mean, that would be a total Luddite thing to say.
Yes.
But like you were saying, the responsibility of advanced humanity in regards to this technology, and now you have the element of societies that aren't sufficiently quote unquote advanced engaging with specifically internet telecommunication technologies.
Well, I mean, there's one 19th century chud who basically figured out the problem here, and it's been substantiated every single time. And this is
Darwin Among the Machines, is that the essay you're referring to?
No, it's a guy called William Stanley Jevons, and he looked like a chud, but he just every single time that we get more efficient and that we invent some new piece of technology, we plug it into the exponential growth system with all of its advertising and the way that it shapes people's desires towards maximum consumption. And it just completely backfires.
The libidinal economy, you mean.
And so forth. So, I mean, you take the example of computing. I think that we've gotten something like 1 trillion times more efficient at computing.
Like
1 trillion times. So we can get 1 trillion times like more compute relative to the amount of electrical energy it takes. A phone can do way more computing than like a 1950s basic transistor computer.
Than the space station in the 80s. Yeah.
I mean, like we can do that. But guess what? There were only a few of them in existence, whereas now everyone has a phone, and it was sold and mass marketed to everyone, and it can be mass produced. And so we use more rare earth metals, more cooling, more water for cooling, more electricity, more everything is used, because it became a catalyst for further consumption. In fact, in America, I detailed this in the article, the correlation between efficiency of various engines and per capita consumption is 0.95. I mean, it's extremely tightly packed together. And that's always been the case. Efficiency, which these techno-optimists and the people who shill every new piece of technology would say this is going to save us, that we'll be able to get more with less, and that we won't face the same problems as before. It's an old story. It's been going on for hundreds of years. It's an incremental, we get more efficient at everything, and then we use it to capitalize more consumption. Bitcoin, we've gotten way better at hashing Bitcoin, and the energy consumption of it has just skyrocketed because more and more people then get involved in the industry. And there is really, he's a chud because nothing has beaten this. Nothing has actually beaten this rule. In fact, it even happens in nature. Relatively speaking, a bird is smaller and much more efficient than an elephant, and yet it actually consumes more, has a greater metabolism for its body weight than an elephant. For birds, mammals, for tons of other things, they actually obey this law. It's called Kleiber's law. It doesn't universally apply. It doesn't have to apply. It's not a metaphysical law of the universe or something like that. Bacteria do not obey Jevons paradox, for example. But in any case, there's just it's the idea that we will solve these problems with greater efficiency. It's just a complete myth. It's based on no historical record. It's literally never happened before. There is no case of any material that you can point to where this has really happened.
Well, it seems that the retort that people have is always like, for example, climate change. Can't we invent CO2 scrubbers pull carbon from the atmosphere? Can't we like you mentioned the article, the abundance theory book? It's why can't we have vertical plant vertical farming and synthetic proteins.
Well,
and,
look, this is the problem in a sense with the tech right and the
seasteading is another one, yeah.
and all these people, is that you take some kind of aesthetic vision, some kind of aesthetic political program, and you tie it to
The
various
Chobani solar punk commercial, for example.
yeah, and then you tie this to some kind of startup company, some startup venture where you're trying to sell product. And so the point being that, like, vertical farming, I mean, most of these vertical farms went bust because in order to maintain them, you have to have an expensive team of scientists with high wages, like, in doing it. And, you know, I mean, desalination is ridiculous. I mean, you can go to a supermarket and you can buy a bottle of Fiji water taken from an aquifer in the South Pacific, you know, shipped all the way over to wherever you are, probably quite far away, unless you're maybe like an Australian listener. And it costs less than a bottle of desalinated water because it's extremely, extremely intensive to do this. Like, I think it's probably one of the least ecologically sustainable countries in the planet. It's one of the only two countries in the world which you can see from space, North Korea, because of the lack of electricity compared to the South, right? It's so visible. And then, well, you can see from space because the place is naturally a desert, and yet they have completely transformed nature. They have used mass levels of desalination. They have
that country in the Middle East. We're going to refer to that country in the Middle East for YouTube. Yeah,
they've depleted their aquifers and rivers in order to create this green farmland where there really shouldn't be any. Because they wanted these settlers, they wanted to sort of replicate the lifestyle back in Europe, and they wanted a sort of sense of agricultural self-sufficiency. But
it was a romantic vision of like the settler farmer with the Kalashnikov slung over his shoulder. That was like very the vision.
Well, you know, I mean, the place is basically just a tech industry, urban areas. They've wiped out all of the natural biodiversity. And they have these utterly unsustainable water practices, they just depend on importing foreign natural gas. I mean, that natural gas, that's a finite resource. I think that particular country in the Middle East is going to see biblical levels of destruction happening because literally nothing about that place is sustainable in any way. In the future, and they're not. Sorry, you say. I mean that
country in the Middle East.
They're not necessarily the most unsustainable country on the planet.
They're one of them.
They're up there. I mean, like Egypt or Qatar. And places like that are actually, they're slightly worse.
Well, they say India, even with its vast natural resources, are getting to there because of the population. But
I mean, there's nothing sustainable about India. I mean, there's nothing really sustainable about practically any country at the moment. But yeah. I mean, the thing is, right, like, I'm bearish on everyone. Like, you could go into the details, and I could tell you why a particular country will not have a very good time this century. There are just so many systemic issues.
Well, I mentioned the term libidinal economy, which is a very good post-structuralist book, by the way. But I think that even something that I forget his name, the Australian writer of the 19th century wrote that seminal essay, Darwin Among Machines, that essentially predicted AI technology. But it's sort of like the desire to have something that has no desire in terms of maximum efficiency. But in terms of humanly desire, like I mentioned, the internet and its various uses, it seems that it's a very difficult question to socially engineer in terms of and I know there's like old hat NRX talking point, the sort of like social technologies of engineering a human populace to desire certain things above others required vast degrees of human knowing, required religion, philosophy, anthropology. The question, I think, when it comes to technology itself is the abhorrent nature of human desire on a very deep libidinal and instinctual and sort of like the theory of the hedonic treadmill that a lot of environmentalists talk about. How can we sort of re-engineer the template of the subject at a fundamental level to desire things out of, for example, internet technology that isn't just waste and excess and slop and things that are like, what did Kaczynski call them? Pseudo activities. Like why is it such an instinctual pull as opposed to the vast enlightened degree of knowledge that telecommunication technology can provide humanity? Or is it just that we're never going to beat these natural lowest common denominator impulses towards kitsch, slop, waste, spectacle, excess? And we're kind of doomed in that regard.
I think it is. I think it is possible. I mean, in one of the essays, Pentilinkula says that basically in modernity, you move from a politics of necessity towards a politics of desire. Because when you get energy surplus and when you get this constant ability to deliver growth, then as a politician, it becomes a much more viable strategy to, in a sense, invite a greater franchise, promise people more, and then be able to deliver it via a functioning growth machine, which, of course, in the long run doesn't make sense, but it's an unstoppable selection mechanism towards this of some kind or another. Because if you look at China and so forth, I mean, it's the People's Republic. The whole of modernity is demotic. It draws everybody's desire into the system because it's easy to now integrate. Whereas before, it was incredibly difficult to integrate, and it was much more safe to suppress people with force. Well, I think that as you see modernity gradually unravel, as the complexity of the global system becomes more and more difficult to maintain, as the amount of energy surplus sharply begins to decline, then you will inevitably see, in my opinion, the unraveling of the mass democratic politics of desire, because it becomes too dangerous. You know, if you are trying to channel people's desire and trying to control the mob's whim, then you are on the chopping block when the tide turns and randomness takes its place. That's why the revolution eats its own children. If you play the game of inter-elite competition by mobilizing a hungry, angry mob, then you have to position yourself cleverly whilst that happens. And the same exact thing will happen to you in the future, as long as the underlying conditions remain the same. And that's why the French Revolution, it's not just this singular event, it's this 10-year period of total breakdown.
Yes.
It's a decade of ruler after ruler, party after party, faction after faction being drowned in a pool of blood.
Until Napoleon comes along, right?
Well, until Napoleon comes along and he sorts out the bank and he sorts out the currency and he uses brute force. And those are the main means at his disposal. But in any case, at that point, so much of the elite had been culled that it wasn't so much of an issue there. People had just been cowed by this sheer horror as it had unfolded. But in modernity, because really the French Revolution is fundamentally a pre-modern event, as much as people at the time propagandized otherwise.
Well, was it the first modern event, the French Revolution, or no?
I don't think that the French Revolution really escaped pre-modernity, although that's why it ended up failing. But what it did open up was emergent new political culture, an emergent new political culture which gradually strengthened and took root into something which could eventually take power later.
Which is like liberal managerialism, you would say.
Well, yes, because like there was this whole crystallization of the memory of it, right? Like 1789 and the principles of 1789 became saintly, whereas then the terror became bad. And of course, the actual true historiography, which is that the terror was an absolutely inevitable outcome of the revolution, it became suppressed.
Well, similar to the Interahamwe in Rwanda, I mean, a lot of the social conditions at the time, I mean, the Rwandan genocide was almost inevitable in that sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
But what I would really what happens is that the mass democracy it's incredibly inflexible. You can
Oh
never
yeah,
tell people
yes,
that they're
yeah,
going to
yeah,
have less.
yeah,
Always has to be more, and there has to be more growth. There has to be more entitlement. There has to be more of everything. And as that becomes literally biophysically impossible to fulfill, then it starts unraveling at the seams. Um, and so, I think that we're stuck in clown world really until that starts to crack, because mass democracy is kind of absurd.
yes.
Um, but it's really an unstoppable force until you really start to see it being impossible for politicians. One thing I would say is that, in a sense, collectivism never disappeared, because I was reading about the Spanish Civil War, and there was a student of Ortega y Gasset who was walking down the street, and he saw a sort of an aristocratic, noble woman get out of the tram car in her fancy dress, and she looked very pretty and very made up. And there was just this look of absolute hatred, which one of the sort of working class members of the city on the street gave her. And the student said, it's a pretty, things are really unraveling when Marxism is trumping hormones. And the point is that there was this kind of terror in the Spanish Civil War, which was inflicted by both sides. But there was, on the revolutionary left, this just want to completely stamp out all aspects of the past, including religion, isolating huge swathes of the population.
Almost like the Khmer Rouge in a way.
Yeah, of course. But even though in the case of Spain, they had been secular already during the kingdom, before the Second Spanish Republic, even though the church were not large landowners in the 20th century.
No,
even during the French Revolution, there was much more of a basis for anti-clerical violence from the perspective of a Jacobin, and there was less of it compared to the Spanish Civil War. But it was this absolute violent collectivist ideology which had to stamp out every aspect of the past in order to get where it was. And the point is that the historian says, well, look, we've moved past this era, the first half of the 20th century, totalitarianism, collectivism, and we've moved into an individualist epoch. And I think that that's not true. I think that people are collectivists. It's just that it's become tepid and it's become weak. And it's become ghostly in a sense.
We have terrible forms of individualism and terrible forms of collectivism at the same time in liberal democracy.
But in a sense, once you have energy surplus and once you have growth, for example, in Western Europe, all of the communist parties, they reach a ceiling at about 30% support, but they can't win over the proletariat in Italy or France and so forth. They just can't do it because people are too comfortable.
Well, look where Marxism in Italy was really a huge boon, was in places like Milan with the Red Brigades. I mean, those were like educated upper middle class people. They weren't like Southern Italians, like people of my people,
And well, what happens is that they max out in Britain. The labor movement peters out, becomes weak, and what happens is that there is this seemingly dissipation of all forms of collective, meaningful identity.
Right.
You're a churchgoer or you're a unionist or so forth. But the reality is that people are continuously partisan. They are very groupish. They tend to think in terms of, what will this position do to my social standing? What sort of group do I want to look like I'm a part of? I don't want to look like some kind of fascist or some kind of chud or whatever. I want to be one of the good people. People are very groupish today. The thing is it's this kind of tepid, weak groupishness. It's not something which is particularly violent or inflamed.
It's not intense ethnic interest that the rest of the world has.
What you really see, well, even with the ethnic minorities, they have these little fights with each other. Like you had the Eritrean nationalists having a lot of fight in Britain.
The Hindutva versus the Khalistanis.
I mean, look, there's all sorts of chicanery, but it's not actually the kind of like traditional collapse of a multi-ethnic empire style events happening. And the reason for that is because, you know, these people are Deliveroo drivers. They're flipping burgers. Like they're, you know,
They're
like,
disastrously truck drivers. Yeah.
yeah, their feet have not seen the soil. They're going on pavement, you know, they're plastic. Everything is plastic and fake. And look, these people are not at the moment. I mean, you could, but my point is that the unraveling of mass democracy is incredibly easy to imagine because these forms of collective self-identification, they've not gone away, they've just become dormant. And
Yes.
as soon as material conditions get worsen, things very rapidly unravel. I have absolutely no lack of confidence about it, because one of the things about when I was just a reactionary and I didn't like mass democracy, is that the classics and the ancients, none of them had a theory of what a functioning mass democracy was.
Right.
Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, none of them actually had any conception of a stable mass democracy. They simply thought that it turned into demagoguery and tyranny, because that's exactly what happened in the ancient world.
Well, the Spenglerian view as well. He never anticipated the nature of the all-encompassing end of history thesis, mass liberal democracy, quote unquote.
Well, no, exactly. Yeah. And so for a while, you know, I had already, by consuming the thought of Philip Converse and other people, I understood what a and, you know, the elite theorists, they didn't even think of it as well. But what is a stable functioning mass democracy? And it is one in which you have this kind of stable partisan self-identification. People just vote for their conservative mainstream party, or if there's a downturn, there's a solid percentage of people who scapegoat. But these mechanisms are scapegoating and tribal self-identification. That's how mass democracy functions. And the reason why you can have this kind of stability and this ritualized habituation of the masses towards punitive voting and groupishness is simply this kind of it is this kind of just habits. It's just this kind of like outsourcing of thinking. And it's
total mental entropy and spiritual entropy.
And so that's how a mass democracy functions. However, you know, and the reactionary critique is that, of course, what mass democracy was supposed to be is that, and it's the same thing, for example, with the internet. Yeah. When the internet was invented, there was all this great hurrah in the academy about the idea of an information society, and how everybody was going to have, in every household, the instant availability of information.
The democratization of knowledge, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that didn't happen. People found stupid things to do. And that's both because of the nature of humanity, but also the nurture of the economic system that they live within. But also, what you see is that it was the same thing with mass democracy initially. I mean, it's this idea that everyone will want to take part and conscientiously think and so forth now that they have the leisure time, because they're not a serf, they're not a peasant who has to work backbreaking labor. But the question is then, well, what is a stable mass democracy? Well, it all goes back to energy, because if you have a big energy surplus, then you no longer need serfdom, and people are capable of working urban jobs, and they're capable of working in professions, and they're able to do sophisticated things, and they have spare time, and they can be integrated, and they can be promised things because there is an exponential growth engine. The exponential growth engine allows the reinvestment of the surplus value of society into social welfare, which makes the society more stable. The elections mean that there is a peaceful circulation of elites, and the habituation and the longevity of the system creates not strong partisanship of the Spanish Civil War kind, but weak partisanship of the election cycle kind.
But also like a total suppression of marginal thought or heterodox thinking around politics.
Yes. And so people marginalize these forms of thought because they're habituated to the system, and they're not used, they don't want to question what a sort of a major alternative is, because what they've had has inertia. It's been around long enough, and they're used to it enough, and it functions well enough because of the inputs that are constantly going into the system to maintain the prosperity, that there's no use in rebelling, and people become apathetic. Now, the point is that I understood how the system worked, but it all has to do with energy, because without the energy input, you couldn't have the growth. Without the growth, you can't have the promises, and you can't have the financial returns, and none of it works. And so that's when I became much more confident, and I had a total understanding. And it's also the same thing in a sense with the post-war political order. The post-war political order really requires two ingredients. It required American dominance, and it required globalism. The two things were necessary because with globalism, each individual country requires the sixth continent supply chain in order for just that one country to function. So in other words, if you look at Iran recently, Iran was under pressure from the United States and a certain other country in the Middle East. And the parliament there said, we might close the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, they didn't close it because nothing ever happens because, at least one thing ever happens, is because if they close the Strait of Hormuz, of course, the American Navy would attack them, but also the entire global system would cease to function, and therefore Iran would collapse. So no country has the incentive to really act as a rogue state and shake things up under the conditions of A, an energy surplus, and B, interconnection, and C, a hegemon. You can't do anything, and so not much happens.
But why didn't the Iranians do it? I mean, if they truly, I mean, again, I think I had this tweet that was very controversial, that in the whole thing, the Iranians are probably the most rational actors because they knew their position was weaker. They knew that Russia was occupied with something else, the thing. They knew that China was not in a position currently to challenge U.S. hegemony, and they knew that the certain nation in the Middle East would just bomb them anyways. Yeah. And so what did they do? They called up Trump, and they had this like little spectacle where it's like, okay, Trump's like, okay, these guys are crazy. We're just gonna like bomb a little thing, just get your people out of there. Then if you have to, you're gonna bomb American base, but you're not actually gonna bomb it, and you're gonna like just put the missiles like on the outside of it. And so I think that they didn't close the Strait of Hormuz because they weren't committed to that same revolutionary spirit that Ayatollah Khamenei talked about when he talked about challenging the godless secular hegemon of the West. And so why didn't they do it? Was it because of that calculus that all people experience where any alternative to the system is impossible or leads to things that by definition are impossible?
Look,
or at
the
least
Iranian state had to show their own people that they were not weak and that they were willing to do something.
Yes.
But they couldn't actually do anything. And so what they did is they had the parliament vote, which doesn't actually have any power. So they had the parliament vote to do it. And then later, when the whole issue was then out of the news cycle, quietly overrule the whole thing and not do anything.
Oh, yeah.
And so essentially, because the Iranian economy depends on these exports, and because they need their internal energy infrastructure to work for everything to function, they can't really do much here without collapsing their own regime. But they had to be seeming to be willing to do it.
Well, it happened during Iran-Iraq, where what happened was they tried to close the strait, and then the Americans just bombed them. So, yeah. But yeah, go ahead.
And so in a sense, if you look at the kind of relative geopolitical inactivity of the post-war period, it's because of globalism. But globalism itself, this immense complexity, this immense logistical complexity, which every country is then dependent upon, is in itself only possible because of the energy surplus. And so once the energy surplus unravels, we return to normal geopolitics. And I think
very interesting.
We already are slowly returning to it, but it will accelerate because if ROI keeps declining, because, ROI is energy return on investment. And energy return on investment is the division of the amount of energy that you get out of something and the amount of energy that's actually available to you,
Right.
the net energy that is available. So, for example, in 1930, in the days of the gushers, and the conventional oil fields in America, the amount of barrels of oil that you would get from just using the equivalent amount of energy as 1 barrel of oil was about 100 to 1.
Oh my God.
In the 1970s, when M. King Hubbart's prediction about the peak of American conventional oil came true in 1970, and places like East Texas started to dry up, that the Second World War had been fought using, had gone down to about 30 to 1.
Mm-hmm.
Today, it's about 10 to 17 to 1 on average, with a lot of shale oil being about 5 to 1. And so if you look at...
That doesn't sound too bad, though, relative to the World War II economy.
The ROI, the point is that it's, as a secular trend, has been going down. And it is continuing, and it will continue to go down. And so what has happened is that if you look at green technology, once you take into account storage, transport, maintenance, all of these areas where you lose energy, in terms of analyzing how much energy return on investment you would get in the end, generally the estimates range from about 3 to 1 to 5 to 1. And the estimates for, in a sense, the amount of energy return on investment that you need to have any economy whatsoever other than just maintaining your energy supply infrastructure are about 3 to 1 to 5 to 1. And this is something which Nate Higgins calls the Mordor economy. So the idea of the Mordor economy is that as ROI declines, that means more and more of the economy becomes energy, because the logistics and the complexity of getting the energy become more and more large scale and take up more and more energy. And so in other words, more and more of your economy has to move into just the energy sector. So you lose culture, you lose education.
It's sort of like it's sort of like in Warhammer 40K, you have the hive cities. Nobody's getting educated in art and philosophy there. It's you're a rubber maker. That's what you do. That's
exactly. Everybody would be channeled into a sort of fixed social function. There was no discretionary economy. That's the sort of theoretical limit which we are heading towards. That is exactly what we are heading towards, because it becomes more and more difficult to get oil. So in terms of peak oil, I think the peak oil was November 2018. I think it was.
Oh, wow.
Peak oil probably was November 2018, because since then, we've not reached back to that peak. Now, people might fact check me and they say, we actually have surpassed November 2018. That's not true, because the actual barrels of oil themselves contain more natural gas liquids as a proportion of those barrels of oil. And so what the natural gas liquid, that's stuff like ethane and propane and pentane and butane. So this is like cigarette lighters. It's the chemicals which make plastic bags, or like heating countryside. These are not the same materials as like diesel or gasoline. Or
my daddy said propane. My daddy said butane's a bastard gas. I think it literally is a bastard gas because it's an off product of propane. Yeah.
So, but in any case, the point is that the actual oil that is actually oil, crude, and condensate peaked in November 2018. I don't think we're ever getting back to November 2018. It's possible, but I highly doubt it. But in any case.
Well, even like the imperceptible costs, like, for example, the cost of human capital, it takes relatively short. I mean, I know I don't want to like reduce blue collar workers having come from a blue collar family. I don't want to like reduce them down to cogs, but like in terms of the human capital investment on a blue collar worker on an oil field, the exponential cost of educating, for example, a repairman on these giant wind turbines that have the skill and knowledge to repair them, but also the fortitude of the safety required to go to these 100,000 feet, like that, what is it, like 200 feet in the air and rappel down on the rope on fixing the turbine.
Yeah.
Like insane, right? Like it requires.
Yeah, but also, I mean, this is something which Tainter and Patzek, they call the energy complexity spiral, which is one of the sort of explanations. But look, the conventional easy oil, that's gone for the most part, and that's never come back. Conventional oil peaked in 2005.
I think James Howard Kunstler also talks about this in various books. But
yeah, and essentially what we have now, even if we find more of it, is all lower ROI. And yeah, it does involve much more risk management. Like look at deep sea drilling. I mean, that requires so many computers, calculations, risk management to prevent spills and all sorts of other things that needs to be constantly monitored.
And disastrous things can happen to those crews out there as well. Yeah.
But look, what you see is that fossil carbon, the ROI of it has declined, and the ROI of these alternative energies is so low that it's not possible to think of a complex, prosperous civilization being based upon them.
Yeah, it doesn't even matter at a certain point. It's almost like you're expending energy just to get nothing in return.
Well, exactly. That's exactly right. And so, but the point is that people may object and shriek and scream and say, oh, but we actually get energy from the solar. Well, the point is that if you imagine your whole green growth society, all of the mining which would have to take place to get the batteries for the winter months when the solar is weaker, and the massive expansion of the grid, which would have to take place to get all of the power for the electric vehicles.
Like in China, those fields of just solar panels, like it's like a solar panel environment.
Yeah, well, I mean, the solar panels are low power density, and so they take up much more space physically to get the same amount of energy as say coal. But look, you know, in China, the ROI of their coal has gone down. I mean, they are just as susceptible to all these problems as us. And
wait, for a second, for those who don't know, who missed it, ROI means energy return on investment.
Yes.
The energy that you produce, the investment you're going to get out of expelling energy to make energy.
Yeah, it's the ratio of energy invested and then the energy that you get back from it.
So you're saying like when Trump, he said like drill baby drill, you mean like that drilling is that's already been tapped?
Well, drill baby drill is a good thing. It's a good example because and I think Trump, the policy there is essentially drain America first.
Right.
Because the thing is that you can do more drilling, but that's exactly like adding a bigger straw to your milkshake and then slurping the bottom of it faster. The only way in which you can add oil is by discovering more wells. And it's literally the peak of oil discovery in America was the 1930s, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the shale oil, they knew about that for 70 years. It's just that they didn't know how to access it. Now we do, and now we're already reaching the end of the shale boom.
But I cut you off. You said about China's also reaching their capacity?
China, the ROI of Chinese coal is going down. And also, China is the biggest oil importer in the world. They don't have very much of it domestically,
right.
And so they would be affected by by declining ROI and depletion of oil as well. And by the way, natural gas is also going to peak as well before coal does. Yes, and the point is that the myriad functions of oil, like, you know, your tractors and combine harvesters and trucks and mining equipment, ships and aviation, petrochemicals, that's not being replaced by anything. It's an unfulfillable. It's like an act which you can't get a follow-up act on. And yes, so essentially we are headed towards a democracy where fewer and fewer amounts of the economy can go to anything beyond base, simple functions of maintaining the most basic infrastructure. That's the direction that we're headed into. And also, if you have a stagnant input of material inputs, which we will, because there are bottlenecks, there is ore erosions, there are all sorts of things that we are headed towards. If you just have a static input, that's enough to actually tank the financial system, because the financial system is based on exponential growth.
Infinite growth,
interest. You need to return back all of the purchasing power, which was created by the banks and the central banks, with interest. And so
but it's a fake system. Like, it's a fake capitalistic system. Like, why do we rely on infinite growth? Like, don't we have enough iPhones in the world? Like, oh, I'm sorry, it would be monstrous to deny other people's iPhones. Like, it's, but in terms of like the fake financial economy, why is it like, I know there's a long genealogy and history as to why infinite growth became the model, but in your analysis, why is infinite growth still a necessity when we clearly know that it's by definition a law against nature? Right. So,
well, I think that we do it because we're locked into it. Like, people need to not go, they need their debts to be serviced by future resources arriving.
right.
And if you have sunk huge debt upon the premise of the availability of future resources, then you are trapped into that system. And we have been in a system really since the 1970s, and especially since the adoption of fiat currency, a system built upon debt. We have unfunded liabilities. We have massive amounts of unfunded liabilities in terms of pensions, in terms of government debt, in terms of all of these forms of debt.
Healthcare, especially here in Canada, yeah.
Yeah, so
and the UK, and the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But what this debt means is that basically the MMT people, the modern monetary theory people, are right about money in the sense that money is debt. And so what happens is that you go to a bank and you ask for a loan for 10,000 Canadian dollars. And what they would do is that then they would just create that purchasing power. That's created purchasing power out of nothing. But they also do a double entry bookkeeping, so they also create a liability at the same time. And the point is, you have to create sufficient productivity that you can then pay back that loan eventually with interest. So that's how the system functions.
Right.
You create all of this money via debt. The debt allows you to consume far more and create a far bigger economy with no brakes upon it, like commodity currencies. I mean, we obviously broke the rules all the time, but commodity currencies did form some kind of physical limit. But now we abolished all of those limits, we create all of this purchasing power, and we're locked into a system where we need future growth to arrive. Now, people's perception of, in a sense, having a fake economy is, in my opinion, slightly misguided in the sense that production has never been higher. We've never had more industry. We've never had more agriculture. It's all at its peak. However, as far as a financier is concerned, they don't care whether that industry is here or whether it is somewhere else. And in fact, they'll make more return on investment if it's somewhere else.
They don't care if it's an H-1B coder or an American or a British person.
No, it doesn't matter as long as they're getting a return on investment. And so, if you are a financier in London, you don't care about the jobs of anywhere else in the country, as long as you're receiving dividends from this global system. But these people do require there to be exponential growth. Otherwise, all of the debts which they own are liquidated, and they're worth nothing. So yes, there does. And so here's the thing: the reason why where the MMT people go wrong and they fall into deep delusion is that what you can't print are ecosystems. What you can't print is energy or resources. So if you were to actually try and just, in a sense, because what happens is that, no, we do not have a non-fiat currency. We have fiat currency. We don't have a commodity currency. But we kind of act and lie as though we have a commodity-backed currency because the government doesn't just print money to solve problems.
Yeah.
And they could do that. The MMT people are right. They could do that. Because the government is not like a household. The government actually creates currency. It's not like you who has to run like, you get income and you can't overspend and so forth. The government is not like that. But the problem is that this runs into biophysical limits. Money, what is money? Money is a claim on reality. Money is a claim. People say, well, money is, it's about purchasing goods and services.
Well, money is energy, as David Icke said. Yeah, money is energy.
Yeah, it is. Money is a claim on energy and resources. And that's what it is. But the point is that the planet stays the same, whereas the claims you can generate infinitely.
It's like Bitcoin. There's only so much Bitcoin, but so you have to like proliferate the claims in each individual Bitcoin.
Yes.
Yeah. Allegedly, but who knows? There's probably a lot of scamming, and it's probably just BS. But yeah. But that's the model, right?
Yes, but yeah. So I think that what we see, what we're going to see this century is ecological problems which are accelerating, and which we have ecological problems which are accelerating in terms of biodiversity will reach various tipping points if we just keep going business as usual. What we also see with aging population globally is that creates much more unfunded liabilities and pensions that can't be serviced.
Healthcare as well.
What you also see with declining ROI is that you will see an increasingly large energy sector and less ability to service people with culture or education or any form of luxury. What you see with various bottlenecks is that the plans of the bureaucrats fail because the energetic costs of doing all of this mining, it becomes clear that the technocratic plans to take us out of these problems aren't going to work.
Right.
What you will also see is the breakdown of globalism. The global six-continent supply chain becomes too expensive, and you will see then more rogue statism. You'll see more people trying to seize their neighbors' resources. That's the kind of direction that we are headed in. And I can say that with a pretty high degree of confidence because the rise of debt, the decline of ROI, the depletion of resources, the ecological, these are all very, very stable trends.
Yeah.
And if you have a biophysical view of the world, they're not that difficult to see coming. Now, there will be routes and rallies. There will be technology which will ameliorate or draw out certain things. But I think overall there is no escape. There is no way out. And we are locked into this system until it eventually becomes untenable.
Well, thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Geo's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every Content Minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.